Dr. Eyal conducted her postdoc research on pharmacokinetic imaging. She edited a special issue of Pharmaceutical Research dedicated to drugs in space, completed a sabbatical with Space Pharma. She is the academic mentor of the Israel Space Agency, founded Hebrew Youth University program Mars Colony, and serves as a consultant to Space Pharma. Today, her space will be about drug interactions in space. Could this even happen? Dr. Eyal, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this wonderfully organized meeting. And I also enjoyed listening to the previous speakers. I will present the topic of drug interactions in space, and I put the question of whether they could happen, but now that we have the Starship not exploding this time and going to the moon and Mars and taking 100 people simultaneously, some space tourists, I think that this might not be a question of whether, but rather a question of when will drug interaction happen. And I will go back to my conflict of interest. I am a consultant for Space Pharma Israel. So this idea was born at a student meeting in Singapore, actually, students of pharmacy, the idea of exploring drug interactions in space. And I was discussing with the editors of Pharma Research the project of organ on chip, which was launched to the ISS by the National Lab. And I took part of this project during my sabbatical in Seattle, and we worked on kidney on chip. And then the editors were very excited about this field, and they suggested issuing a special issue of Pharmaris about medicines in space. I asked the late Dr. Hartmut Derendorf, who was also present there in Singapore, to join me as a senior, actually, co-editor, and we put together several interesting papers. One of them was about drug interactions. So the drug interaction in space project was kind of a student exercise. I thought, let's try to see whether the drugs that are available on board the International Space Station can interact with one another and possibly with future drugs and so on. And my victim was this student, Erez Berman, and he is a licensed pharmacist who is now doing his PhD, MD studies at the Hebrew University. So I'm his mentor, and his studies are generally related to other fields, but he was excited about doing this analysis. So this time it was a kind of a low-tech analysis. We wanted to know whether the recently launched up-to-date application, which launched on the International Space Station, will be able to accurately predict drug interactions on board the International Space Station. The producer, Walter Kuhl, or distributor, Walter Kuhl, were very excited to announce that NASA is using their software on board the ISS. Previously compared 3 drug compendia and the FDA-approved labels of anti-epileptic drugs to see to what extent they concord with one another. It's known that the drug compendia do not well concord with one another, but this was like an extreme situation. What we found there was that when we compare Lexi Interact clinical pharmacology and the FDA labels, we get to maybe 10% of concordance among the data sources. This means that for each 100 interactions, potential interactions, only 10 would be available or described on all drug interaction sources. So this is something which should be taken in mind, and usually you need at least 2 drug interaction sources to see that your interaction is like established and not a class-based interactions or interactions, something like this. Even within any 2 sources, we didn't have good concordance, usually 30%, 50%. So we wanted to see whether this lexicomp source can predict what would happen between the drugs on board the ISS, and we compared it to another data source. So these were our sources, the up-to-date application and Micromedic, both very well established. They each has its own limitations, and now the question was where we take the list of drugs available on the International Space Station from. This was a major issue. So as you heard before, there are published drug lists from historical missions like the Gemini and the Apollo missions, and you can see the drugs that were used there like meperin, cyclizine, dextroamphetamine, propoxyphene, but this is not very up to date, and we don't have any access to NASA databases. This was a lost chance. I mean, we couldn't do it. So we tried searching the web, and when you go searching the web, you find interesting and sometimes wonderful websites. So one of them was this, Government Attic, which is a website which provides governmental documents for the public. They use the Act of Freedom to apply by legal ways to the government, US government, and ask for all kinds of information. So this one was published in 2016. The applicants requested the following items. They didn't get them all, but this is what they requested. Look at the list. Some items are really interesting, and you may ask yourself, why would anyone want this type of information available? So let's look at the second item, the appendectomy emergency procedure manual, okay? How you conduct appendectomy on board the ISS, how you conduct cholecystectomy, removal of gallbladder on board the ISS. And here's the best. Number 7, the NASA official procedure manual for burial in space in case someone dies. So among all these other items, they asked for the manual for the space station medical kit. And they got it and they published it. And again, this is from 2016. And you can see here a partial list. There are 65 pages there. Not all of them contain the drug, but at least we have something to begin with. Now, you may claim, and you will be right, that this kind of information is shady and dubious, and maybe we need something more reliable. And then we turned also to this publication that was also mentioned by Dr. Watering. And we found there actually 24 drugs that were mentioned on the table. It was something related to pharmacogenetics. And 12 more drugs were listed elsewhere in the paper. So now we could confirm a large part of our original list. Some other medications were mentioned in other publications. The authors of this publication also sorted the drugs without listing them all according to the enzymes that are involved in their metabolism, and about 1/4 were CYP3A substrates, another quarter, you can see it at the upper right side, were CYP2D6 and CYP2C9 substrates. Some of them are actually quite commonly used on board the ISS, as you heard earlier. So our other sources, this was a major source. You heard about this paper before by Dr. Watering, and many of the drugs that were found to interact by us were sleep medications or drugs to treat the space motion syndrome or several other conditions. So you also saw these similar pictures, how kids look like on the ISS. But when we started analyzing the list, it looked more like this, an entire pharmacy with hundreds of interactions and things that you may see later in your career, because there are many drugs on the ISS. There are now at least 110 or maybe even more. And I'm not going to get into all the interactions. What I want to say is first that we sorted the drugs according to the drugs available on the ISS according to the number of total interactions in which they are involved. So when you look at the list, look at the promethazine. It was also mentioned earlier by Dr. Watering. Promethazine is quite commonly used, and we also discussed it in person a couple of weeks back. And it has, in general, it depends on the database you look at, between 100 and 200 interactions, known interactions. Not all the interactions are with drugs that are available on board the ISS, but we also analyzed the number of interactions we found within the more limited list of drugs in space with the total possible number of interactions, and we found that they correlate pretty well, which means that the more interactions a drug has, or potential interactions a drug has on the ground, it will tend to interact with more drugs within the limited list of drugs available, in this case, on the ISS. The correlation, you can see here to the right an outlier. This is phenytoin. Phenytoin had more than 400 potential interactions, and it was available on the ISS. So even if you remove it, because it can skew the correlation, you are still remaining with more R of 0.72. So what we also did was classifying the interactions. To make a long story short, I would say that many of the interactions were of mostly moderate severity and major severity, but the reliability of the data was not very high. It was categorized by us as one. One means fair. And what does fair mean? It means that the interaction was assigned based on a class effect. So for example, if you provide promethazine, it's highlighted here in this second number 178, promethazine with zolpidem, they are both commonly used drugs on board the ISS. They are both CNS suppressants, but so there is a potential for interaction. However, no one has ever studied this type of interaction. This is the case for the majority of interactions that were identified. And like I said earlier, when you look at the risk, only LexiInteract categorized the interactions according to the risk. When you look at the risk, you can see that the majority required therapy monitoring. Severity, majority was 70% were moderate, but the reliability was fair for the majority of interactions. We also looked at the extent to which the pharmacokinetics of one drug can be affected by the other when we had this data published. And for some interactions, we could find 6-fold change, for example, in the AUC of the victim drug, the one which is affected. For example, if an astronaut on a very rare case takes omeprazole and fluconazole together, then the omeprazole concentration would increase, at least on Earth, 6-fold. And you heard that you have no ability to predict to what extent it will increase on board the ISS or in space in general. So some of them were more, the magnitude was larger. We also, I said earlier that we wanted to compare the concordance among these databases. So about 50% of the interactions listed on the up-to-date application available to astronauts was also listed on the other data source, which means that many of the interactions are not very well established, or might be some class effect. So it doesn't mean that the interaction does not exist. It just means that there have been no study in most cases that proven that the interaction exists. Now, I'm not going to go through this list, but what I want to show you is that many interactions had common source. The majority of interactions resulted from potential interactions, okay? Additive CNS suppression, anticholinergic effects of drugs, and 18 interactions, especially those involving azithromycin and ciprofloxacin, involved potential QT prolongation. Now I want to discuss it a little bit because QT prolongation is an issue when you come to astronauts, and it is an issue because cardiac arrhythmias have been reported before in space, even during extravehicular work like spacewalk. So the issue of cardiac arrhythmias, it is known, the reasons are not well established, and one of the papers suggested that cardiac arrhythmias may even be one cause, may be the use of QT prolonging drugs, especially if you combine several drugs together. I told you that there are many class effects and other non-specific warnings and so on. So what are the problems with those false alarms? First of all, you might have heard already in your studies that excessive number of alerts are associated with alert fatigue, which means that the patient or astronaut turns off the alarm and just takes the medications. And this is one issue. The other issue is that when there is a potential combination like this, safe and effective drugs may not be combined because there is a concern which is not actually established. However, and this is known not from the space-related studies, space pharmacology field, this is known from the ground studies, that when there have been attempts to reduce the number of these non-specific alerts, it ended up not always in good outcome. For example, an attempt to reduce the number of alerts about potential QT prolongations resulted in lesser ability to identify patients who later developed QT prolongation due to drug interactions. So currently there is no effective approach to decrease the less relevant alerts. What I also found after we started this study was that NASA has on their human roadmap a plan to estimate the potential of drugs to interact in space. And Dr. Watering is listed as an investigator, the principal investigator here. I liked this sentence, not only that they use established databases and the FDA labels. The sentence says additional manufacturers of the medications in the ISS medication kit will be asked to share unpublished information on the useful lifespan of their products and their degradation products. Okay, so now asking from the manufacturer's data seems like a good way to get the real data that they have. I hope that this will work. So to summarize that far, I would like to say that most potential drug interactions that we identified, potential, are those that are even on the ground not established. We don't have studies for the majority of cases that show that the promethazine interacts with zolpidem. We guess that this will be an issue, but we don't have studies like that. Some drug combinations may be associated with clinically relevant consequences, and I showed you, provided the example of the QT prolongation or even the combination of sleep medications that was mentioned already by Dr. Kast may be problematic when an astronaut has to perform an emergency operation, something which requires full attention. This is not necessarily the optimal setting to conduct something which requires focus. And after taking some of these medications by their own, you're not allowed to drive, or you don't want to drive. So a combination of these compounds doesn't seem like a good idea. It is a good idea to adjust the future drug-drug interaction studies for interactions that are commonly expected in space. Just conduct them under simulated microgravity, and I'm going to show you in a minute what I mean. Before I wrap up, I would like to show you this incident, which was mentioned already by Dr. Watering. During a study on jugular venous blood flow in 11 astronauts, a blood clot was found in the jugular vein of one astronaut. They didn't say whether this astronaut was male or female. They are not allowed to disclose it, but there was a blood clot. And now comes the issue of what drug could be given to treat this blood clot, because as you know, there are protocols and clinical guidelines for similar situations on Earth, but no one knows what this is in space. So after consulting an expert from North Carolina, they started to treat this astronaut with enoxaparin, which was available on the ISS, but not mentioned on any of the lists that I checked, I have to say. I didn't find it there. So there was enoxaparin, they started the treatment. The first choice was apixaban. However, apixaban was not available on the International Space Station. So they launched it to the station together with other items, and only after 43 days, apixaban was available for treatment of this astronaut. The clot has not resolved until returned to Earth. Now look at this drug, apixaban, and this is an exercise for you. And ask yourself, apixaban, as you know, is a substrate of CYP3A4 and of PGP. What drugs that are available on the International Space Station could have interacted with apixaban? Has the astronaut been treated with any of them? So this is something which shows you that the interaction studies are not totally out of the connection to anything. And another thing I would like to highlight is that not all space travelers are professional astronauts. There have been already 7 space tourists in space. One of them flew twice, so actually 8 flights, and there are more flights planned to come. Now, this one, Richard Garriott, has become famous. He wasn't quite healthy when he flew to space, and he himself published 3 papers about himself. You can find it on PubMed. He had, as you can see here in the second paper, a giant hepatic hemangioma, cross-fused ectopic kidney, and some other space tourists also had medical conditions. So when we look into the future, we expect people which are not quite healthy to go to space and require sometimes requiring more than one medication. So this is, by the way, Richard Garriott is a game developer, so he's quite an interesting person. Now that the interest in space is increasing, and you can see the number of PubMed entries for astronauts increasing, what happens with our knowledge about drug pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics, and drug interactions? So here is a table that summarizes what we know about the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, in space. Okay, this is what we know, okay? So we had this plot, we were plotting of poisoning an Israeli space tourist who is about to go to space in a few months, and we wanted to give him one pill of melatonin. Well, it's an OTC preparation, but we wanted to measure the EEG, we wanted to measure blood levels and see what happens. But the foundation who was launching this call was less excited about this idea than us. So we're not going to do it. If you have a planned Greek astronaut or space tourist and you have the opportunity, go for it with any drug. But in the meantime, we don't give up. So I mentioned when I started talking that I am consulted for an Israeli company, and the Israeli company took the entire lab. My lab area is 80 square meters. They squeeze it into 30 by 10 by 10 centimeters. So this is the size of a milk box. I hope you can see it. And everything is there, like spectrophotometer, microscope, refrigerator, medium, pumps, cells. So you can send this to space. They launch their labs on board their own satellites. This is a satellite, or ISS. This also can go to space on a space vehicle. This is the American space unmanned space shuttle, miniaturized space shuttle. This is the European one. So a lab like this can go on any space shuttle, which is manned or unmanned, and there you can conduct your experiments and study whatever happens to any part of the human body in vitro. And by that, I would like to thank the organizers again, and thank you.